Hey guys, in today's video, I want to teach you how to use the context API in React. So the context API allows you to have global state and pass down values globally throughout your app, or you can choose to pass it down through only specific parts of your app. And I'm going to be showing you guys the best way to interact and consume with the context API using custom hooks. And at the end, I'm going to do a small, short little demo on how to do something like an API request and hold that data in the context API, so within your context, rather than have it within something like your local state. So let's get started and let's create a sandbox. So head over to codesandbox.io. So this is just to create a local dev environment. You want to use the React template. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to remove all this JSX here. And the first thing that we have to do to actually use the context API is to create a context. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call this context.js. And let's import React from React. So to create a context, we have to import the method from React, which is createContext. We then specify our context by creating it as a variable. So we say we can name it whatever we want. So I'm just going to call this the to-dos context. Of course, you can name this whatever you want. And I'm going to say this equal to createContext. So you pass here is actually your initial default value. I'm going to actually be setting this somewhere else, so we can just leave this for now. So now that we've created a empty context, and you can see this isn't within a component or anything, this is just on its own. Let's next create a normal component. So I'm going to call this to-dos context provider. So normally I just call this whatever the context name is and then just provider at the end. And this is just going to be a simple functional component, which we're going to use to wrap the part of our app that we want to allow access to this context to. So what I'm going to do is just return. So what I'm going to return is the to-dos context actually has a provider on it. So we can do to-dos context dot provider. And what this means is, so what this accepts is a value. And this value can be anything like a string, boolean, an object, an array, anything you want, even methods. And so everything within these two tags here, everything within this provider will have access to this value. I'm going to show you guys how to get access to that, but I just want you to know that it has, whatever you want to have access to this value has to be nested within here. So I'm just going to grab props and just say props.children. So for now, the value I'm just going to pass down as hello world as a string. It's not very useful, but we will change this later. I just want to show you guys the basic fundamentals of the context API. Then I'll show you guys how to use things like custom hooks to make this a lot nicer. So I'm going to export default the to-dos context provider. So not the to-dos context, although this one we will have to export on its own. And now let's save this and head over to our index.js. So I want to provide this context to our entire app, which in our case is just this app component. So let's import the to-dos context provider from context. Then we're just going to say to-dos context provider and then get app and put it inside of it. So now app is our children, and here we're saying props.children. So app has access to this value because we have nested it within our to-dos context provider. So now we are providing this value hello world, which is just a string for now. How do we actually get access to this value? So how do we get access to this within app? Or even if app, let's say we create a second component here, which is just going to say be a h1 saying test. So let's say this component here, how would we get, and if this was, so if we did it like this, so let's say here, so this is nested within app, so it doesn't matter how far nested down this is, as long as it is wrapped within the context provider, then you have access to the context. So how do we actually get access to the context? So we do this by importing from React, so we have to actually import useContext, and then we say, so then let's create a variable. Let's just call this context value, and this is going to be equal to useContext And then in here, we have to actually specify which context it is that we want to use. The reason for this is because you can have more than one context in your app. So in this case, we just have one, but I could also create a, let's say a users context or something like that. And then I'd have to do something similar for that and provide that as well. Just wrap that within whatever part of our app we want. But for now, I'm just going to keep it as one context. So remember, we do also export the to-dos context. So let's import that from context. And so now I'm just going to say the context that I want to use is that context that we just created, to-dos context. So now I'm going to console log the value. And if we open this up, you can see we have hello world. So within a nested component, nested within our app, we are able to get access to this value. So this is the fundamentals of the context API. We pass down a value, attach that to the provider, specify which components that we want to wrap with this, and only those components will have access to this context. So if I was to create a component out here, let's say, so it's just some component, this component would not have access to the context. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so now let's actually make this something a bit more useful. So let's say I wanted to create some state here, and there's just going to be a normal use state hook, where initially I'm just going to have this be an empty array. Actually, let's just add in some elements, so like wash the dishes. What we can do here is, remember I said that we can pass anything we want to this value. So I'm going to choose to pass an object, and this object is going to have a state value, a state property, which is just our state. So the shorthand for this would just be state by itself, and the same thing with set state. So we're passing in state and set state as values. So now throughout our app, we're going to have access to this state. So let's actually save this. And if we look here where we console log our context value, we have an object with state and set state. So I could do something like map over that. So I could do context value.map .state.map. Alternatively, we could actually just destructure this. So we just do state and set state. So just destructuring it directly from the use context. Then we can just map through this, just return a paragraph tag with that element. So here we have wash the dishes, and let's actually create a button now. So let's cut that for a moment. Paste this back in. And let's actually just create a button here. And all this button is going to do is just add a to-do. So I'm just going to say add handle add to-do. And all this is going to do is just set state. Let's grab the previous value, and then let's just return the previous value and a new one. We could do something like do homework. And let's just connect these. So on click, handle add to do. So, this also does need the key. So I'm just going to say key is equal to element. So now we have the wash the cars, which is our initial one. And whenever I click add to do, it adds it as a new task. This error here is just because the keys are actually the same, but that's not something we need to worry about for now. So now let's actually look into using custom hooks to take care of some of this logic for us. So a common hook that you might want is just use get state or something like along these lines. So this would just return the state. And the reason you want to do this is so you don't have to constantly be importing useContext and constantly importing the context that you want to use. Instead, you can actually handle that within the hook, and then you can reuse this hook throughout your app. So let's do that. So we have state, and this is going to be equal to useContext, and this is within our context that I'm creating the context file that I'm actually creating this hook. So I'm just going to specify that I want to use the to-dos context. And then what I'm going to do is return state. And let's actually also export this. So export that. Now let's import this. So I'm actually going to get rid of the useContext import here. I'm going to change this to use get state. And now this will actually just return state. So this part here won't be working right now because we don't have get set state. But as you can see, we have the state here. So now it's actually made it a lot simpler. We can actually remove this import as well of useContext. And instead the hook takes care of it for us. So let's create another hook. Use add to do. And all this one's going to do is get set state from context. And this one's actually going to return a function. So when you initialize it, it won't do anything. But then when you call that function, this will run. And here, I'm just going to get the to-do name. I'm just going to do set state, get the previous values, spread those in, and add to-do name. So now if I import this, and then instead of this, I can specify add name here and say use add to do. So this should actually be add to do. So now this, initially when we call this here, so you can see we call it. So this part here runs and it returns this function, but this function hasn't been called yet. So when we actually want to use this, we can just do add to do and let's say new to do. So now when I click this add to do button, it adds this. So it takes this name here that we pass here and it just appends it to the state. In this example here, it's not actually the most useful since this is a fairly simple set state, but sometimes you might want to do something like mutate that data, do some loops, edit it, and do whatever you want really. So the logic might be a bit more complex than this simple one we have here. So in those cases, using a custom hook to handle this would actually be ideal, since you can just create the hook once and then reuse it throughout your app wherever you want. Okay, so I've got through the fundamentals of the context API. So just to go through it one more time. First, I have to create our context. We then just create a basic wrapper component, which is just going to get the provider on the context and specify what values we want to provide and to what. So in our case, we're providing it to the children. Then I decide to wrap the entire app with this. So of course, you don't have to wrap your entire app with this. If you know that you're not going to use this context in, let's say, throughout most of your app, you can choose to only wrap a certain part of your app with this context. So that way you don't have this context everywhere. Then I showed you guys how to use the context normally. And then I showed you guys how to use custom hooks. So where we use the useContext hook, specify which context we want to use. So in our case, the to-dos context. We just destructured the state value that we get from here. So we just destructure that and we return it. This is the simple one. And then now we have another hook to add a to-do, where same thing, we get the context, we destructure set state this time. And then this time we're actually returning a function so that we can call the function like this, specify the name of the to-do, and just append that to the end of the array. Okay, so now one more thing I want to do is actually make an API request. So I want to make an API request whenever the component mounts. I want to store that data in context, since let's say this is some sort of data that you're going to be using a lot across the app. So this way we can sort of cache that data and we can update it whenever we want. So let's actually just remove this first one for now. I'm going to slightly change the structure of this, so we might get some errors. So I still want state and set state, but now I'm going to have an object here. I'm going to have an isLoading field. So by default, it's just going to be true. I'm going to have data, which by default is going to be null, and error, which by default is also going to be null. Let's also add is updating, which by default should just be false. Okay, so now our state consists of this. Let's add Axios as a dependency. So to add a dependency, you just come over to the side here, type the name of the dependency and add it in. So just add Axios. Now, what I want to do is create a hook that is going to fetch the data when the component first mounts. And then later on, we're also going to allow it to refetch the data. But first, let's just try fetch the data. The API we're going to be using is just JSON placeholder. That's just specifically this API here. So there will be a link to this in the description. This will just fetch an array of about, I think if we load it in here, you can see it's an array with just objects, user ID, a title, and completed. So the way that I'm going to do this is first I'm going to, we actually want to get both state and set state. I'm also going to rename this to use fetch to-dos. So we have state and set state here. Let's just ignore the return for now. Then I'm going to create a function fetch data. This is going to be an async function. And I'm going to first set state. I'm going to grab the previous state and then just return the previous state. And actually, before I do that, there's one more thing I want to do. So I just want to check if previous.data. So if we have some data, then I don't want to say loading is true. I want to say updating is true. So let's say we already have an array with a bunch of data in here. Then I don't want to, on the UI, normally you would have something like a loader. And normally that loader would show when isLoading is true. But in this case, we already have the data. It might not be the most up-to-date data, but we still have data. So I don't want to set loading to true. Instead, I want to set updating to true. So that way we could show that, let's say, a little spinner on the side to let the user know that we're currently fetching the latest data. So if there is data, then all I'm going to do is return, spread in the prev, and say is updating true. Otherwise, so in the case that we don't have any data, so this is our first time fetching that data, I just want to return previous data and set is loading to true. Okay, so now this just handles our loading state. Now I want to create a try catch block. And I'm just going to do response is equal to await axios.get. So make sure to import Axios from this. And the URL is just going to be this URL here, which will be in the description below. So this will just make a get request to Axios, and we're going to await that. Okay, so what I want to do now is actually just set state. So I'm going to set state. I'm going to do, I'm actually not going to get the previous data. I'm just going to do is loading false, is updating false, error. Let's just set that to null. And then data is going to be response.data. So if this is successful, then it will go to the next line. But in the event that this Axios request throws an error, it will go into this catch block. So here, what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the set state. Is loading and is updating should both be set to false, so that's fine. Error should be this error here. And then data, I'm just going to set that as null. So now we have this function that fetches data. So initially it sets the state to sets is loading to true, or sets is updating to true, or sets is loading to true. It then tries to fetch some data with Axios against this API here. If it's successful, it will put that data into state. And if it's not successful, it will put the error into state, and it will, in both cases, turn off the loading. Because that's a very simple API here, a very simple function. And what I want to do is say react.useEffect. So we're going to be using the useEffect hook, where we pass a function and then our array of dependencies, which in our case is just going to be an empty array. So this is equivalent to component did mount. So this will only run once when the component first mounts. And I'm just going to say fetch data. So as soon as the component mounts, so as soon as this hook mounts onto the component that you're using it in, it's going to call fetch data. And what I want to do is just return state. We will change this later on, but for now I just want to return state. once again, it's just going to, as soon as the component mounts, call fetch data, set the loading, make the API request. If it's successful, get the data in state. If it's unsuccessful, get the error in state. And it's just at the end, it's going to return state. So now let's go into our app here. Let's remove this and change this to what we called it here. So use fetch to dos. Let's import that at the top. And let's say state is equal to use fetch to dos. And then just for now, I'm just going to comment this out and just remove that. And actually, we're not going to have this button at all. Now I'm going to console log state, and let me just refresh this. So you can see state initially is loading is true, data is empty, error is empty, and is updating is false. That's because we have no data, so it chooses to set is loading to true rather than is updating to true. After a little while, we see here is loading is false, is updating is false, error is null, and data is an array of 200 items. So if we look at data here, it's 200 items, and they're both the same as what we get from the API request. So we've now successfully got that data when the component first mounts using this use fetch to dos. So now if we just map through that data, we can just do this. So if I uncomment this, if I actually just redo it. So state.data, so state.isLoading. Then we want to say loading. Otherwise, we actually want to show the data. I'm not going to do any error handling here, but you should actually be doing error handling as well. This is just a simple example. So otherwise, I do state.data.map and grab the elements and just return a paragraph tag with the element.title. So here we have all of the to-dos titles, which are the same as the ones we have here. And when the component first loads, you won't be able to see it. I think it's quite quick, but it actually does say loading for a split second. So now we're actually able to fetch the to-dos when the component first mounts, and we're storing that in our global state. So now one more thing I want to do is just actually have the ability to fetch this data again. So right now we're returning just state, but let's say we make an update to this and we make an API request to the database, to our API, and then that updates the database. And now our data here is actually no longer valid. Our data is actually old, and we need to fetch the new data. So the only way you could really do that right now is to force your component to unmount and then remount. That way it would cause this to trigger. But that is not the correct approach to this. Instead, you want to expose this fetch data function to your your components. So we can do this really simply. We just return an object. So we still want to return state, but I'm also going to add in a refetch property here, which is just going to be fetch data. So refetch is just going to be this function that we created here. So now state is actually not valid anymore. Let's destructure state and refetch. So this is fine. Let's create a button. Let's say refetch data, and on click refetch. And let's also just console log state, just to see what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, so if we look here, you can see initially when the component first mounts, it's the same as before, and then loading is complete. Now let's click refetch. Let's actually clear this. Click refetch, and you can see is loading is false, but is updating is true. You still have the data here, so it's actually fetching it while still showing the old data. And then once this is done, so here, this is the last true. So here it actually sets data to the new data. In our case, the data hasn't changed. It's just this dummy API. But if the data had changed, then it would have set the state to that new data here. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you understand how to use the context API now, how we have to first create it, then provide it to the part of the app that we want to provide it to, specify the values we want to provide it to, and how one of the best ways to use the API itself is to actually create custom hooks and then just hook into the context here, and instead just use these hooks within your components rather than having to do this logic yourself within the component. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a like. If you guys want to see more React content, then take a look at my channel and I've got a lot of React videos there, and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Bye.